Francisco Pinto Balsemão, who as Prime Minister helped guide Portugal's new democracy after years of dictatorship, and who was later head of the country's largest private media group, Impressa, died on Tuesday at his home in Cascais, Portugal. He was 88. His death was announced by President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa of Portugal, who once worked for Mr. Balsemão at Expresso, the newspaper he founded in 1973, a year before the overthrow of Portugal's dictatorship. In his announcement, Mr. Rebelo de Sousa called Mr. Balsemão one of his country's most remarkable figures of the last 60 years. Mr. Balsemão was a champion of press freedom, a crusading journalist, a publisher, and a television impresario. He was also a politician who tried, with limited success, to conciliate warring left and right factions in his country, and was a founder of a leading political party, the Social Democrats. And he was a wealthy descendant of Portuguese royalty who regularly filled the gossip pages, as Le Monde wrote in a 1992 profile, which called him Citizen Kane on the Tagus, the river running through Lisbon. He presided over the last governments that ensured the transition from revolution to democracy, Antonio Costa, the prime minister at the time, said in a speech when Mr. Balsemão's memoirs were published in 2021. In December 1982, as Prime Minister of Portugal, Mr. Balsemão stood in front of the White House as President Ronald Reagan saluted him for the continued progress of democracy in Portugal. It had been only 8 years since junior officers in Portugal's military, fed up with the country's fruitless colonial wars and its 4-decade dictatorship, overthrew it in a largely bloodless coup known as the Carnation Revolution. The Many Lives of Francisco Pinto Balsemão was the headline in the Portuguese daily Diário de Notícias after his death, and he had already lived a number of those lives even before he became Prime Minister, in January 1981. He occupied that precarious perch until the summer of 1983, following infighting in his fragile coalition of centrist parties and its poor showing in municipal elections. 10 years earlier, Mr. Balsemão had directly challenged the dying dictatorship censors by founding Expresso, a weekly newspaper that soon became one of Portugal's most spirited publications. 63% of Portuguese people have never voted was the bold front-page headline on its first issue, published on January 6, 1973. The government was furious, but Mr. Balsemão was already well acquainted with its repressive tactics. As a young journalist at the newspaper Diário Popular in the 1960s, his father, Enrique, and an uncle, Francisco, held a majority of the shares. He was regularly called in for interrogations by the dreaded secret police, known as the PIDE. "It's nothing compared to what some people suffered," he said of his various encounters with the PIDE in an interview with the Portuguese channel PSDTV in 2015. "Others were tortured, imprisoned," he said, while he himself was merely a brave braggart. In 1971, as a reformist deputy in what was then a rubber-stamp parliament, he again incurred the ire of the government by pushing for the abolition of censorship and the autonomy of newsrooms. He and others made a much-publicized visit to the regime's political prisoners in 1972. The next year, with his share of the proceeds from the sale of Diário Popular, he founded Expresso. His role there would earn him more visits from the PIDE. The revolution of April 25, 1974, saved the newspaper, he later told interviewers. The censors had been hacking such big chunks out of it that it was difficult to keep going. In the new Portugal, with friends who had been fellow reformists, he founded what became the Social Democratic Party, now the country's ruling party. When one of his fellow founders, Francisco Sá Carneiro, was killed in a plane crash in 1980, Mr. Balsemão succeeded him as Prime Minister. He confidently told Bernard D. Nosseter of the New York Times, in an interview in Lisbon the next year, that a new military coup would be impossible in Portugal. The army, he said, had a commitment to democracy. In fact, one of his chief accomplishments in office was abolishing the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, which had immense oversight power. His other significant achievement was preparing Portugal's entry into the European Economic Community, now the European Union, in 1986, 3 years after he had left office. He had spoken to the Times in 1981 of his project to develop Portugal, a society marked by shantytowns in the cities and hovels in the countryside, for social justice. He remarked that because a severe drought had affected the economy, he had been forced to cut half an hour from the country's nightly television programming to save power. "I suppose that will mean an increase in the birth rate," he said dryly. It was the era of Margaret Thatcher, and Mr. Balsameo proclaimed that the private sector should have priority because the state is too big. In the tempestuous cauldron of post-revolution Portugal, Mr. Balsameo's cool style stood out, phlegmatic, elegant, relaxed. Le Monde wrote of him as Prime Minister, calling him the most British of the young wolves of the Portuguese political class. But even though he was open to dialogue with all, as Le Monde wrote, infighting within his Democratic Alliance coalition, which included monarchists, proved too much for Mr. Balsameo. He resigned in December 1982, though he held on months longer in a caretaker government. Political parties in Portugal, he told the Times' John Darnton the following January, can't be based only on people but must have some clear ideas about where they want to lead. Francisco José Pereira Pinto de Balsameo was born on September 1, 1937, in Lisbon, the son of Enrique Pinto de Balsameo, who owned a textile company, and Maria Adelaide de Castro Pereira. Through his mother, he was the great-great-grandson of the son of King Pedro IV of Portugal. A child of privilege, he grew up in Lisbon's wealthy Lapa neighborhood and attended Pedro Nunes High School in Lisbon. He obtained his law degree from the University of Lisbon in 1960, and while he was in law school he befriended the future King of Spain, Juan Carlos. After serving in the Portuguese Air Force, he became editor-in-chief of its official magazine in 1961. It was when he became a cub reporter at Diario Popular, associating with the scrappy journalists who made it the country's best-selling newspaper, that his political consciousness developed, according to Diario de Noticias. His steps over the course of the next decade, which led to outright opposition to the regime, followed naturally. After he left office in 1983, Mr. Balsameo returned to Expresso, expanding the Impresa empire to eventually include the country's first private television channel, Sociedade Independente de Comunicação, in 1992, as well as more than 30 newspapers and magazines and other media holdings. The publications, except for Expresso, were sold in 2018. The television station soon became the audience leader in Portugal. Mr. Balsameo is survived by his wife, Maria Mercedes Aliu Presas, 2 daughters, Monica Balsameo and Joana Balsameo, 3 sons, Enrique Balsameo, Francisco Maria Balsameo and Francisco Pedro Balsameo, and 14 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. His marriage to Maria Isabel de Lacerda Rebelo Pinto de Costa Lobo ended in divorce. A memorial service was held for Mr. Balsameo on Wednesday at the Jerónimos Monastery in Lisbon's Belém district, an honor reserved for the most prominent Portuguese. At the service, President Rebelo de Sousa said Mr. Balsameo preferred the solitude of resistance to the dictates of submission, adding that in a closed Portugal, the former prime minister had helped to open up the country to democracy.